called 911. In her halting French, all the more fractured because she was out of breath, she tried to describe where in the woods they were. When she returned, he was lying where she'd found him. "Sir," she said, "my name is Grace. Je m'appelle Grace. I called for help. Everything will be all right. Vous êtes sauvé." She put her ear next to his mouth to hear his breath. His eyes were still closed, but he heavily, unmistakably sighed. Later at the Montreal General, she realized that both pairs of skis had been left behind. The emergency workers had loaded the man into the ambulance, and she had followed it, weaving through the traffic along Côte des Neiges. She wasn't even sure why, because the Urgence Santé men had looked at her expectantly, assuming she and the man had been skiing together? Because one of them had said in commingled English and French, "The police, ils vont vous poser des questions at the hospital," and she had nodded obediently like a schoolgirl? It was partly curiosity, to know what had driven him to such an act, and partly pity, because anyone driven to hang himself would have to be suffering deeply and terribly. And it was partly that she of all people had been the one to throw herself across his path. Maybe it was just because she wanted to know what had happened. Regardless, she was sitting in the waiting room hours later, shivering each time the glass doors slid open with an icy draft. The linoleum was streaked with gray-brown slush people had tracked in, and she could smell car exhaust and cigarette smoke from the sidewalk outside. There was no sign of any police officer wanting to ask her questions. The man had been wheeled off with a canopy of nurses over his still silent body. Grace waited, though she wasn't sure for what or whom. When she remembered the skis, probably long gone by now, she smacked herself on the forehead. Hers were practically brand new. She looked at her watch. It was 7 o'clock, completely dark on the mountain. She was tired and hungry and ready to go home. Before she did, though, she wanted to know that he was being taken care of. She walked over to a nurse at the reception area. "Excuse me," she said, "can I see him?" The nurse didn't look up from her paperwork. "Qui, madame?" "The man who was brought in earlier, the skier." "Who?" "Well, I don't know his name. He was found on the mountain." "You don't know his name?" "Well, I found him up there." "So you aren't family?" Her tone was hostile, weary. "I'm a therapist," Grace said suddenly. "Une psychologue?" The nurse nodded, her manner softening at the French. Now she seemed to grant her a professional capacity, and Grace didn't disabuse her. "I must see him as soon as possible," she said, trying to sound authoritative. The nurse hesitated for a moment, then shrugged and pointed to the elevator. 316, she said. Grace knocked before entering. The man was lying on his back, wearing a hospital gown, an IV drip attached to his arm. He was staring at the ceiling with a blank expression that didn't change when she came in. Whatever pain he'd been feeling on the mountain was absent from his face now. He might have been waiting for a train. Visible around his neck was the thick red abrasion from the rope. Clearing her throat, she sat down in a chair next to the bed. "Do you speak English?" she said. No answer. "Vous parlez français?" Again, nothing. "I took a little Spanish in high school, but that's all gone, so these are pretty much your only options," she said. His clothes were folded and stacked on a bedside table. "I'm going to look through your things for your name, unless you specifically tell me not to." She went through the clothes, feeling for a wallet, and he made no move to stop her, even when she found it and pulled out his license. John Tugwell. English, after all. She put everything back as it had been and sat down again. "John, my name is Grace," she said, "and I'm a therapist, though that's not why I'm here. I was just skiing when I found you lying on the ground. The branch you tied yourself to broke off. I called the ambulance." But for a blink, he made no sign of being conscious. She couldn't even tell if he was listening. His hands, palms down above the blanket, lay flat, unclenched.